Welcome back to the final panel of the New Horizons in Journalism Conference. Thank you all for coming and being here, and the live audience too. I hope you've enjoyed this. We're now going to have the final panel on charting the future of media in Bulgaria. And this panel will be in Bulgarian. So as I mentioned, the English speakers probably should get some headphones, and the audience, the live stream online, you'll have to switch gears or switch mindsets in your mind. But I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel, Stoyana Georgieva, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Mediapool, which is an independent online daily news publication that is sensible, rational, among all these journalists. So, Stoyana.
Thank you. Здравейте на всички. Ще се опитаме да говорим малко по-бавно.
We'll try to talk moderately fast to enable interpretation.
За независимата журналистика в България са проведени толкова много семинари и толкова
Many conferences have been held on the topic of independent journalism in Bulgaria. A lot has been said already, and yet we keep on discussing it. Because we hope, and we do not only hope, but we are positive that this battle needs to continue. There are problems that independent media providing high-quality content in Bulgaria face, and these are systemic problems. First of all, to have independent media, you need to provide for them independent funding. This is what their independence depends on. They need an independent owner, an independent publisher. These media need policies and fundraising that supports them well enough and sustainably. However, the structure of the media market in Bulgaria, along with the very much limited advertising market, make it very hard to sustain an independent media business. There are different rankings and analyses made by prestigious international organizations, and every year they find that the media environment in Bulgaria has been worsening. According to the last Press Freedom Index, Bulgaria ranks 112th. Out of 180 countries. We rank last out of the EU member states, and we do even worse than the Western Balkan countries. What are the main reasons pointed out in that regard? Violence against journalists, intransparent funding of media, including European funding distributed by the Bulgarian state. Comments have been made about the smear campaigns that journalists have been subjected to, the harassment that they have to undergo, the threats and the violence that they face. The judiciary is also used against journalists. All of these findings on behalf of Reporters Without Borders have not been very surprising for the Bulgarian society, much less for Bulgarian journalists. Many measures have been proposed many times to solve these problems. However, bad news is that these issues go very deep. Some people think they could be solved by changes in the legislation, but that would not be sufficient. Very often in Bulgaria, laws and regulations are just a facade that is used on behalf of dependent regulators and bodies to serve certain businesses or certain political interests. So to secure transparency over media ownership is basically to secure transparency over ownership of businesses overall. And this only makes sense. It may sound as a joke, but in Bulgaria, for years on end, it has been a mystery who owns the biggest ski resort here, called Bansko. May have heard how the situation played out after the Prime Minister himself let out that this is one of the owners of the biggest banks in the country, first private investment bank, Secuminev. However, it is illegal for this banker to have such a significant exposure as a part of his company, so he cannot be legitimately the owner of that ski resort. This is why, officially, this ski resort was supposed to be owned by an offshore company based in Cyprus, the owner being a very modest Cyprus citizen, a very modest wealth. This whole scandal was all over the media, and as a result, the official owner was changed, and now officially ski legend Mark Girardelli is the owner of the Bansko ski resort. Similarly, we have former MP from the Party for Rights and Freedoms, Venelin Petkov, who used to own a lot of media, officially or not. Most of them he sold. Long story short, if we had rule of law, if we had organs and regulatory bodies and institutions that worked, then it would have been much easier to trace the money. It would have been much easier to reveal who the actual owners of media are. And it would have been easier to keep the environment functioning. But again, for that, we need transparency and well-functioning regulatory bodies and institutions. And now on to Mr. Parvan Simeonov. He's the executive director of Gallup International Balkan. He will introduce to us certain statistics and will try to provide an explanation in terms of how Bulgarian society perceives independent media. What is the price that people are willing to pay? Do they perceive information as a right that they are entitled to? Or rather, do they realize that this is a commodity, much like any other, that has its price? Thank you for this introduction. This introduction is a very good start for what I wanted to say. We are all being very idealistic sometimes. That's why today, for a change, I would like to take a more materialistic point of view. Let's think about the factors, not the symptoms. Let's discuss the reasons. It's very easy to say, this guy did this, that guy did that, the Russians did this and that, but the question is always, what makes this possible? To me, the main explanation for everything that we've been discussing today and yesterday is poverty. The explanation is material. We are a society that is poor, that is aging. We are a society of great regional differences. So independent media is the last concern on our minds, and we have no right to be surprised by that. To be completely honest, there is not much that we can do about this if it's true what I'm saying. We have a structural problem. It's a material problem. Very often people in Bulgaria will say, well, we are what we are. We think what we think. This is what we are like. This is what we think like because we are poor. We even have a saying for that, which goes, a poor person is the devil himself. I'm sorry for this pessimistic explanation, but we are a peripheral economy that adds almost no value. So the economy fall. Then secondly, we live in an environment here and in the Western one overall where each person alone can be a media. And because everyone can start a media of their own, everyone can believe everything. Fake news are half-truths usually, fake information mixed with the truth, and these are the most dangerous type of news. So, because everyone can publish news, we have to encounter the dark side of democracy. People are on social media and they transmit news. They are media owners themselves, and they can be heard. The only thing that can save us in this situation is our own taste. We have no choice but be selective about whom to believe. I'm trying to be abstract in order to stimulate the discussion and be more provocative, if you wish. But we live in the midst of our own product. We lived in the midst of democratization. And this is the dark side of an otherwise good process. It's all about dialectics. Democracy creates what will eventually kill it. So we can talk a lot about whose fault it is. But that's not the main question. If there is a niche for it, we'll find a culprit. External forces, foreign governments, the NGOs, the conservatives, the liberals, the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese. There'll always be a culprit as long as this is going on. Because, as I said, we live in a world of post-truth, and likes count more than facts. In this age of post-truth, a story, a narrative, counts more than the truth. It sells better. Stoyana said it herself just a little while ago. This is what the market model is right now, because the market needs to sell. And speaking of independent media, what do we mean by independent media? My interpretation is the following: a media that can sustain itself, that can be self-sustainable. So here comes the question, is society ready to pay for content? Because it's not important whether a media is independent or not. It's important for them to produce reliable content. That is why these media need to be self-sustainable. Are people ready to pay? In a study that we did, I asked that question. I'm not sure if we phrased the two possible answers well enough, but we wanted to test them, and I wanted to see where people's instinct will lead them to. So the question was, what is closer to your way of thinking? That information should always be free, or rather that information is sometimes worth paying for? Both are true. I would be happy if information is always free and there are no limits to it. At the same time, I do realize that information is valuable. So what were the responses? 66% said they prefer the information for free, and then the 22% said that they would be willing to pay. I don't know what the situation outside of our country is, but obviously Bulgarian society treats information as a natural resource that they are entitled to, and they're not ready to pay for it. And since they're not ready to pay for it, the state has to pay for it. Governments will pay for it. Behind behind-the-scenes interests will pay for it, because these media need to sustain themselves somehow, and society will not support them in that. When it comes to the aging population, they're even less ready to pay for information, maybe because they're poor, maybe because they come from the previous generations. It is better when we discuss the situation in Sofia and big cities and younger people. They are more aware of the need to pay sometimes. This is why you need to make a difference between state media and private media. And to try to wrap up and kick off the discussion, just one last thing. We asked people, what is the new normal on social media? To follow someone because you want to learn something? Or to follow someone because they think like you? Young people will say the second answer. The older people will respond with the first answer. There is no clear social picture. In brief, we live in a society that is not ready to pay for quality. They're ready to pay for water supply. They're ready to pay for electricity. They don't mind paying for natural resources. However, information for them is a natural resource that they're entitled to for free. And one more thing, we live in a society that increasingly opts for the content that confirms their own position. And I'm afraid this is the new normal, and I'm afraid this does not only pertain to Bulgaria, but the entire Western world. So I'm afraid we'll have to learn to live with this, just like we'll have to learn to live with the coronavirus. Fake news is nothing new. Disinformation is nothing new. They have always been part of human history, and we've never been able to cope with that. We'll just have to live with these things because they have been multiplying in the context of globalization. So what we have to do is adapt and learn to discern it and avoid it. I talk too much, I think, so I will come back with you.
Thank you. I would just like to remind of an important fact. That is that Bulgarian politicians, which apparently are no exception to the rule that applies to the whole of the Bulgarian people, in other words, they also follow what people want to see or hear. Over the past 20-30 years, we've had debates, discussions, but nevertheless, there has never been a fee introduced, a fee to be paid by the citizens for the upkeep of the public media. That is the Bulgarian National Radio, the Bulgarian National Television, and the Bulgarian Telegraph Agency. I can't remember when was the last time that we discussed this issue, but anyhow, there was such a backlash when this was done, and everybody was so scared as a result of this backlash that the state, the government in particular, is the only party that makes a decision as to the budgets of the Bulgarian National Television and the Bulgarian National Radio and also the Bulgarian Telegraph Agency. That's a separate topic. I don't want to go into that, but nevertheless, we should remember that this is a very powerful tool through which the state can incentivize one of these media, for example, the national television, which apparently is more obedient, more flexible in that sense, plays along with what the government wants and so on. Whereas the Bulgarian National Radio did not turn out so easy to be cracked. And there still are journalists there who have their own opinion, who oppose to what they are told, and they cannot easily be harassed or pressurized. And as a result, their opinion and their behavior is being punished. I'm not going to go into that. As I said, I just wanted to go back to this idea that is very alien to all of us, this idea that we need to pay for high-quality content. And it is also alien as an idea to the public debate in general. Now I'm going to move on to Venelin Petkov, who is a very prominent figure in Bulgarian journalism. He has been one of the reporters and the newscasters of one of the big private TV channels in Bulgaria, BTV. Then he became the director of the News, Current Affairs and Sports Department, which he did until 2020. And he is the only Bulgarian journalist to receive the prestigious USP Body Award for Excellence in Television, Radio and Online Media. After the ownership of this TV channel changed, this distinguished journalist was forced to resign. So now he will tell us what he thinks about mainstream media in Bulgaria and what his opinion is about Bulgarian TV channels in general. I would like to ask him to share with us what his opinion is as to the independence of these media outlets. Thank you very much for this presentation. I wanted to start with a joke from a village fair, but I might leave it for the end of the discussion because I was very struck by what Parvan has just said. I would just like to oppose some of the things he said, oppose his opinion in terms of facts, that is. Yes, indeed, I spent 20 years working for this private channel. I'm one of the people who actually set up the News, Current Affairs and Sports Department at that TV channel. I was one of the people who started working there when there was literally nothing in the building. It was an empty hall. For the past 6 years, I used to work as a director of this News, Current Affairs and Sports Department. Over the course of these 6 years, I've abided by and defended the principles that were the principles of the previous owners of the TV channel. That is independence, medium freedom of this Bulgarian TV channel as a private, independent media outlet. Unfortunately, while I was still the director, the BTV was the only independent national TV channel, private one, in the Republic of Bulgaria. The only one, the sole TV channel. The minute that the ownership of this media was changed, I was immediately made to resign. After that, there were events and processes which you all witnessed. I don't need to explain or retell. A lot can be said, though, about the technology of pressure that is exercised. We are going to get there, I'm sure. I witnessed how it works. The same can be said about my colleagues who no longer work in mainstream media. This is something that we have to talk about. Nobody talks about that, especially people who are subjected to that kind of pressure. This is something that I hope we're also going to discuss later. But let me now go back to what Parvan and Stoyana said. These are colleagues I've known for maybe 20 years now, and we've worked together, and I respect them a lot. To start with, freedom of speech is something that is directly linked to freedom of media. That's a general rule. There is another thing that people are not aware of sometimes. Maybe sociologists are not aware of that too. Air TV channels currently are still the main source of information for the mass public in Bulgaria. In other words, the Bulgarian audience, Bulgarians in general, still get most of the information on a daily basis. I'm talking about all kinds of information, regular broadcasts or other types of broadcasts from the three big channels: the national TV channel, Nova TV, which is one of the two private channels, and BTV. So the Bulgarian people in general receive most of their information from the three national TV channels. Even the smaller media outlets, the ones that operate online, that have 3 TV sets in one small room and with the support of a small computer program, simply edit the interviews that were given by the guests in one of the 3 big TV channels. And this is much of the content of the so-called small independent media outlets in Bulgaria. So even these independent media outlets even further multiply the importance of the 3 big national TV channels. And there is a root cause behind all of this. Remember when there was the boom of TV channels in Bulgaria. This happened when TV channels, be it cable ones or not, were already in decline in Western Europe and in the US. When I used to live and work in the United States back in the 1990s, the TV channels were already in decline. So at that point in time in Bulgaria, we couldn't even talk about that kind of TV channels at all. There was no such market yet. The market for that appeared when the first license was given to BTV in the year 2000. It was then that all of a sudden Bulgaria started going through what the Western societies had already been through 20 or 30 years earlier. So there was this lag of 20 years in Bulgaria. We got this boom of 20 years. There is a generation of people who grew up with that kind of TV channels, starting with the BTV and then the second private TV channel, Nova TV. And this is the root cause for everything that I talked about earlier. People are still very much used to the fact that it is the TV channels that are the main source of information for them. Especially for people of 40 years plus. About 20 years ago, these were the active people. They were 20 back then, so they were raising their children with the BTV news. It is now their children that are in the most active age. So this is the second generation for which free-to-air TV channels are, to a certain extent, the main source of information. This is the reason why mainstream media outlets, I mean the national TV channels, are of supreme importance as a source of information, and they are an important stakeholder in the political system of the Republic of Bulgaria. This is clear not only to me and the people who are in this trade, that is journalism, but this is perfectly clear also to the people who govern Bulgaria. And I'm referring to the politicians and representatives of all kinds of political parties, and people who occupy different positions of power. I would like to mention one more thing before I give the floor to my colleagues. There is something else which we need to remember. We have to know who the owners are. This has to be clear information. But still, this is not guarantee enough for the independence of the particular media outlet or the editorial policy that it is going to have. This is so because the people in power, especially for the past 10 to 20 years, have learned in a very good way how to attempt, I would like to highlight that, to try to exercise pressure on completely independent private foreign companies, be it via threats, for example, for making sure that their business will soon no longer exist, for example. So this is a process that we've been witnessing for quite a few years now. And this process is yielding its results already. Once again, I would like to highlight that former owners tended to defend their independence. And I'm referring to the BTV channel. Somebody else should be talking about the other private channel. But they tried to defend their independence as much as possible. The minute the ownership was changed, the minute the old owner was nowhere to be seen, then we ended up in a situation of free fall. Free fall for people such as me, for people like my colleagues who were relieved of their duties, who were laid off, the way I was, by the way. A free fall. When you no longer have anyone to go to, I mean the independent owner. So as a result, when this independent owner is no longer there to support us, then we end up in a situation of a free fall. I apologize for taking too long. Not at all. I think that the audience finds this very interesting. For those of you who are not familiar with these processes, over the past year and a half, what happened in Bulgaria was the biggest transformation of the media market. It was a transformation of the TV market in particular. The two big private TV channels now have new owners. Both private TV channels are now owned by companies which have telecommunication companies in their portfolios. In other words, the BTV was sold to the deceased Peter Kellner, whereas Nova TV, which is a TV channel which underwent quite a few ownership changes over the past few years, was first transferred to the Domoshchievi brothers, a prominent family of Bulgarian business people, to United Group. United Group is a fund which owns Vivacom, one of the two big private telecommunication companies in Bulgaria. Everybody knows that telecommunication businesses are subjected to very strict regulations on the part of the national governments everywhere. Especially with this transfer to the 5G network now, we all know what's happening with the regulations. So the telecommunication companies are very much dependent on the national regulatory bodies. What Venelin pointed out earlier on has to do with the fact that the former government attempted, and on many occasions it did succeed, to exercise pressure on many companies, foreign companies included, in order to get what they wanted. When we talk about the TV channels in particular, especially through Nova TV, the government propaganda and the pro-government views were clearly disseminated via that private TV channel. And now we can see that in BTV much more obviously. We can see that in the editorial policy of both of these national media outlets in particular. All of us, the journalists, independent journalists, saw how BTV transformed after the change of ownership. There are no coincidences in life, that's what I can say. Now, we are moving on to the next level. We started with mainstream media. Now we are going to talk about local news, the local media outlets, the ones that people on a local level rely on. Because these news have their own specificities, and they're meant to provide information to people in the different regions, to make them come together, to organize discussions, and so on and so forth. So if when we talk about mainstream media, we talk about their funding and how independent they are, let's see what the model of operations for the local media outlets is. I'm going to ask this question to Spasov, who is a journalist, a long-term correspondent for Capital Weekly and Dnevnik.bg for Varna. He's currently in charge of a website called ProVeritas, which actually comes up with very interesting independent content from original journalist point of view.
I have the challenging task to speak after Parvan and Venelin. But either way, you cannot take out regional journalism from the comprehensive picture of the media landscape in Bulgaria. It's impossible for the regional landscape to be fundamentally different from the national landscape. Journalism, especially regional journalism in Bulgaria, has hardly been alive over many years now. You can hardly catch its pulse. And it is only thanks to events like this one that we can even discuss this coma that it has ended up in. To paint a more vivid picture, you can imagine regional journalism as the dark net. You have no idea what's going on there unless you specifically go there. I would like to resort to this slang definition of the dark net, according to which it's only cops and drug dealers there. It's much the same in regional journalism. There are smugglers there smuggling whatever, fake news, propaganda, pro-Atlantic or vice versa. Its regional media is full of texts that have unknown sources, whose information comes from unknown sources. It's full of stories pertaining to local celebrities and oligarchs and their friends. It's full of tradesmen that deal with audiences, and the audiences are unaware that they're being sold. Something else that you will notice if you decide to dig into regional media. Another similarity to the dark web. Owners are very often behind the scenes in regional media. They are undercover, they are unknown. They are hidden, much like in the mainstream media, because what they do is not always legal and not always proper. Let me give you an example. My colleague Emilia Dimitrova, who is present here with us, helped uncover that example. She works in Sevlievo, and while investigating media in 2019, she found out that 3 municipality servants hosted a radio show about the municipality's programs and discussed the municipality's issues. So the municipality pays for that radio and pays for the servants, and they get to speak on that public municipal radio. Something that we could hardly imagine, but they do occur on a daily basis all over the country. There are great people in regional media, great professionals who put their hearts in their jobs, and they are ready to defend their work with their lives, with the price of everything. In smaller places, in smaller towns and villages, everyone knows everyone, and the distance between people is much smaller. So the question is it possible for a nationally distributed media to substitute regional media? I think this is not possible, and I say this because I have experience as a correspondent, a local correspondent for one of the biggest national media. I think this is impossible because nationally distributed media, centralized media, have a different type of view on news stories. They need to make every story interesting to a wider audience. So what happens is that very often small issues that are big issues for local people in smaller places are disregarded and neglected because they cannot be promoted to wider audiences, and they become niche stories. At the same time, the national media finds these small issues too small to cover. So this has been going on for years, and the sense of justice has been decreasing the further you get away from Sofia. Why does this sense of justice disappear and keep decreasing? Because journalists in regional media have no longer courage or strength to keep fighting this fight to improve the lives of local people. So if you want to ask the question why regional media is important, which is basically the question why is media important, then this is what I have to say. And again, it comes from my experience working with other colleagues around the country, especially with regard to the ProVeritas website. Everywhere you have the same stakeholders, the same people that have interests and that are after the same resources. We are talking about the same players, the same companies. But here is the problem. We have public resources leaking in portions small enough to go unnoticed. But if you sum them all up, the amounts will be completely comparable to the money that was leaked under a corrupt procurement related to a highway development, for example. This makes it very hard for businesses to develop and thrive, because what you get is a circle of private companies thriving thanks to public procurements that they're entitled to. And of course, this kills competitiveness. This kills local businesses that cannot get to these public procurements. And this kills any hope that local people may have for economic independence, which eventually undermines the entire system. And that is why it makes sense to talk about how important media is, even if it's a very tiny media in a very small place. These media have, in the end of the day, the goal of defending people's lives and improving them, defending the lives of local people, that is. So this is why, back in 2017, with the help of the America for Bulgarian Foundation, I set up this website, the ProVeritas website. I want to make it explicit. I could not have made it without the foundation. Here is how the idea came about. I was on a trip to the US with the World Press Institute. At that point, I was with a group of journalists, and this is when I first met Paul Steiger. The very idea of setting up an NGO dealing with investigative journalism seemed very attractive to me. I decided that it was a great idea. So I came back and I decided to go for it. I've been asked many times what ProVeritas is, and I've been replying that this is a platform for critical investigative journalism. But lately I've started replying by saying that this is a community of journalists working all over the country, people who are very courageous and exceptionally brave to keep doing what they're doing despite their circumstances. These people did not know each other 4 years ago because they would be fighting their fights on their own separately. However, as journalists, we all realize that you can always benefit from teamwork and from networking. We've been working with 8 people. 5 of them have been present at this conference. We are a virtual team. We exchange information. We try to provide help to each other. And something that was very important, with the help of ProVeritas, these people managed to get a sense of solidarity. A sense of solidarity that we all need sometimes in our work. So it's really paramount for a struggling journalist to know that there are so many people that are behind their backs sometimes. We also received financial help that is critical whenever we are subjected to pressure, especially using the judiciary. This is a classical way of putting pressure on journalists in smaller villages and towns. You can press charges in such places very easily. And the point, of course, is not to win a case, but to rather use this as a tool against independent journalism. So when I was trying to recruit people to work with to set up ProVeritas, I would very often get to hear, I'm sorry, I can't be part of this because I will be sued all the time and I cannot afford to fight that. The platform additionally aims to make the work of our colleagues more visible. Networking is another benefit. We establish contacts that are very important and helpful. So 4 years have passed since the beginning of the project, and I hope we get to keep working together for at least 4 more years. I do not have any illusions that we could do that with the help of advertising revenues or any other way, really, apart from donations again. And donations on behalf of a powerful foundation such as America for Bulgaria. I say this because businesses in the country outside of Sofia have long been in a symbiosis with the local administrations. You cannot get a public procurement unless you are friends with the local authorities. And this is why no one can afford to be supportive of a media that is not supportive of the local authorities. As Parvan mentioned, additionally, people in Bulgaria are not willing to pay for quality content. They're not interested in high-quality journalism. So we don't have the option of relying on private donations. But still, we plan to keep evolving and producing video content, podcasts, etc., with the hope that will make the work of our colleagues even more visible.
Thank you, Spas. The last aspect that we are going to talk about on this panel has to do with a phenomenon, which is a great cause for concern. This phenomenon results from all the long years during which journalism, which was told what to do, was flourishing in many newsrooms. Many media did not feel the need to develop journalists by high professional standards. As a result of that, we gradually came to a situation in which there is a huge decline of thematic journalism. Vesislava Antonova is going to talk about that. She's a person who is quite well familiar with this situation. She used to be a journalist for the Bulgarian National Radio for 15 years, and then she worked for the Capital Weekly. As of June of this year, she's been the editor-in-chief of a monthly business magazine called Manager. Plus, she's a member of the National Council for Journalistic Ethics in Bulgaria. Vesislava, you have the floor. Good day, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of that very interesting and very important event, because after all, it has to do with the future of our profession. Being the last one to speak can sometimes be difficult, but it can also be easy, because after all, in that way, you have the chance to contribute to filling in the gaps in the picture of media, of the media landscape in Bulgaria. For the sake of foreign guests in the room, I'm going to allow myself the liberty to say another 2 sentences about my professional career. I've had the rare chance to not only graduate from the Department of Journalism, but also to end up in the Bulgarian National Radio, where I started my professional path in, I believe, the best way possible. And I still believe that the Bulgarian National Radio, for a good reason, has one of the best trust rates in Bulgaria. Then I ended up in a very, very powerful private media. In other words, I became much more familiar with the private media landscape. And last but not least, I've had the chance to see for myself what takes place in the Department of Journalism in Bulgaria, as I'm one of the lecturers in the Department of Journalism with the Sofia University. So as of the beginning of this school year, I also started teaching at another Bulgarian university, the University of National World Economy, where they also have a department of journalism, focusing more on the business aspect of it. So at that point, I think I could already make quite clear connections between the different phenomena taking place in the Bulgarian media landscape. For 15 years, I had the chance to keep a close eye on the latest developments in the Bulgarian media market, ever since the first Bulgarian private TV channel was set up. So before I start with the other part of my intervention, I wanted to share a few numbers with you. It might sound a little bit ludicrous to you, but in the morning I checked the numbers, and as we as journalists are supposed to base our interventions on numbers, I decided to go for that. So, as we all know, there can be no high-quality media without high-quality journalists. So the first question I asked myself was, what's the number of journalists in Bulgaria? The only place where you can check that is the National Statistical Institute. And this institute reports to Eurostat. According to the latest data that Eurostat has on its website, there are 3,233 journalists in total in Bulgaria. At this background, the data of the National Statistical Institute says that there are 209 newspapers in Bulgaria. That's for 2020. The National Statistical Institute also points out that this is the number of papers which were published even once. On top of that, there are 77 radio stations in Bulgaria. Because of different specificities of the Bulgarian media legislation, I'm not going to go into, I want to point out the following. Probably about 85, maybe even 90% of these radio stations are musical ones. That is, they play only music. The radio stations which cover the whole portfolio of journalistic genres make up 10% at most. There are 120 TV channels in total in Bulgaria. Of course, the national media are the most prominent, the ones with the biggest viewership. So if we look at the pie chart of the Bulgarian media market, we will see the following. 80% of the advertising investments in the Bulgarian market are allocated to the TV channels, and to be more precise, the two most influential private TV channels, that is the BTV and Nova TV, that my colleagues have talked about earlier on. I wanted to describe the landscape because these facts are very important. Can you imagine how the rest of the market can survive on the other 20%? Do you think that there are real players there? How do the other media outlets survive? I know that yesterday and at the beginning of our discussion, my colleagues have already provided some of the answers as to how the rest of the media, all print media, all the radio channels, all the online media, how they can survive on the other 20% of the advertising budget. So this bleak picture, this very dim horizon, if I have to go back to the title of our conference, is a determining factor to what's actually taking place with Bulgarian journalism. The very limited financial resources that Bulgarian media outlets can rely on forced a lot of newsrooms to reduce, sometimes by half, the number of people who work for them. It's not something that you can clearly see. You can see it only if you're part of it, especially if you're one of us who try to do a decent job on a daily basis. One of the very important facts which also made a lot of journalists actually leave the profession was the very poor pay for journalists in Bulgaria. It's very difficult to create a good journalist, and it's a very slow process. They need to have a very rich educational background, because graduating from the Department of Journalism is not quite often not sufficient. You need to be able to cover different spheres, such as you need to have a better knowledge, for example, of the financial sector, the healthcare sector, the banking sector. I mean, these are just a few of the examples that I can name. Bulgarian journalism has been facing serious issues for a long time now, but the pandemic of last year made these issues even much easier to see, because this reduced the budgets even further. And the lack of high-quality professionals in Bulgarian journalism could be felt very clearly by the whole of Bulgarian society. And this happened at the very beginning, when the pandemic started, when people were very scared, when there wasn't sufficient information, they had to stay at home, and the only source of information they had were the media in general. But if I have to be more specific, it was the big TV channels that they got most of their information from. We had a national headquarters to combat the pandemic. The national headquarters used to have, at the beginning, used to have press conferences each and every day, every morning, actually. So what the national headquarters to fight the pandemic would do was to present very bleak, very gloomy information, which was, by the way, the case in most of the rest of the world. After all, this was a threat that we didn't have very clear ideas how to cope with yet. Back then, the TV channels would air not only the press conferences where we would hear representatives of the government speak, also representatives of the healthcare sector speak, but we could also hear what questions were asked to these people by the journalists. So they were on air for a very long period of time asking questions. And it was plain to see how incompetent these questions were, or at least many of them were. As a result, the Bulgarian audience would get very skewed information, and this information was not presented to the Bulgarian audience in a very good way. So honesty is a good thing, so I'll be honest with you now. Last year, I made a very difficult decision for myself. I love my profession, but last year I decided that perhaps it was high time I took a step back from what I used to do up until that point in time, and perhaps a good way to save myself would be to start teaching, to go to university, and to start doing research, something that I used to do parallel to my work as a journalist. And as a specialized journalist who used to keep a close eye on the developments on the media market in Bulgaria. That decision did not survive too long because it wouldn't have been fair for the students that I was about to teach. So I decided to go for and to say yes to the proposal of the media that I currently work for. Now I'm an editor-in-chief in a monthly business magazine, and I have many more responsibilities, but they are predominantly administrative ones. Why am I making this aside? It was very difficult to go back to my profession, that's why. Before I became editor-in-chief, I continued working as a freelance journalist because I loved my job. So I spent a lot of time talking to the manager of this media because I knew very well what I was about to face. I knew because I'd studied those in previous years. When I was about to make that decision, a few people close to me came to me and said, "How can you say no to that? You shouldn't be a coward. You have to try to put your experience to good use and try to change something in the media landscape." I knew very well that I would go to a media which is a specialized media for economic information with a small team, a team of specialized journalists. This is so because there might not be that many people reading this magazine, but they are the people who actually are responsible for generating the GDP of Bulgaria. These are the big employers, many of whom decently pay all their taxes. That's why these readers of ours would expect us to have high-quality content. I was wondering whether it would be possible to do that with me as an editor-in-chief and another 3 editors. Such is the operational model. We invite analysts who do not belong to the magazine itself to write articles about it. And still, you have to thread carefully as well here. Because, as I said, there are few high-quality journalists, and there are also few high-quality analysts of the individual business sectors. The first topic that I can think of in that respect is the topic of energy. We know that not only in Bulgaria but all over Europe, this will be a topical issue for many reasons. Probably you are aware that the price of electricity was increased twofold, and as you can imagine, this affected the business a lot. This was a topic which we had to communicate about in a very appropriate way via high-quality content, because this would be read by people, also representatives of this business, and it would also be read by our advertisers. We have no other means to sustain our work apart from advertising, and of course the corporate subscriptions that we have. Subscriptions which are made by usually bigger companies for the sake of their employees. So I was faced with a very big dilemma. It turned out that out of the 3,233 journalists who, according to the statistics, operate on the Bulgarian market, there are only 4 or 5 specialized journalists capable of analyzing the energy sector properly. 2 of them work for the media that I used to work for many years. The other 3 belong to 3 of our competitors. Another 3 media outlets which are our competitors, so I couldn't resort to them. That's why I had to go to experts for help. Experts who can actually draft high-quality texts which would be informative enough. So I took a close look at the market. This is something that any editor-in-chief should see, and try to find the objective analysts. There are 2 objective analysts in Bulgaria. If you go to the CVs of most of the analysts, you would immediately find out that they would be willing to defend lobbyists' interests, and no media should become a platform for that. So step by step, I started being faced with this issue on a number of other topics as well. I found out that there were very few specialized journalists capable of delivering high-quality content on the topic of healthcare or legislation. So all of this goes to show that we are part of a vicious circle. Yes, indeed, we are faced with positive horizons in terms of the digital strategies, the contemporary strategies that media can adopt. One of the ways out would be for media to be maintained by subscriptions, which is the case in Western markets. Indeed, but why should the people pay for media that simply cannot provide high-quality content delivered by good quality journalists? Why should people spend some of the little money that they anyhow have on a subscription, which is of a significant amount, in order to pay for media content which is not vitally important to them? I've presented this view of mine on other occasions as well, and I've had the chance to say that, in my opinion, positive change is not going to start at the private market. Despite the fact that the private market in Bulgaria indeed had its benefits. It created some of the best quality journalists in Bulgaria, and it created competition. In Bulgaria, there are good journalists. I would like to highlight that, but their number is not big, and apparently it's not going to grow. In my opinion, this change should start from the public media, because this is the media that we own, we as citizens own. In order to go back to what Stoyana Georgieva said in the beginning, I should say the following. Yes, indeed, the public media is maintained by public budgets allocated by the state. They had very limited private resources according to the Bulgarian legislation, so they are non-market players compared to the other big, powerful radio and TV channels. If we look at the map of Europe and try to see how public media outlets are funded at other European markets, we will find out that this is usually done through subscription fees on the part of all citizens. That is done in the UK, in Germany, and in some Scandinavian countries. Even in Switzerland, a few years ago, there was a referendum at which people were supposed to say whether they would be willing to fund the public media via fee which they are supposed to pay. So thank God the Swiss decided to go for that model. But this has not been happening in Bulgaria for many years now. Still, I believe that this trend can be reversed. If we have no right to tamper with the management of a private company, we as citizens who have rights and responsibilities, we have the right to ask for our public media back. We have the right to ask for the public media to be changed, and this can set an example for everybody else. I believe that the public media can make the market develop differently. They can change the landscape. There are a lot of media in Bulgaria, as I said, media outlets, but you see how much of the money is actually spent on their upkeep. I believe that there should be media outlet bankruptcies in Bulgaria, but I don't know. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. It is a very interesting discussion indeed, and the topic that each and every of our panelists talked about are greatly important, but nevertheless, we are quite overdue in terms of the time allocated to us. We have already some questions online. The first thing I'm going to read is more of an opinion than a question. we should, this person here says that we should not give the big mainstream media to the bad guys, as they say. Perhaps we should start with looking into professionalism in public media. That's one of the opinions. The other opinion has to do with paying for content. This person says that even though the levels in Bulgaria are not as high as the ones in Western Europe and Central Europe, there still are media outlets that can attract private donors, and efforts in that process should continue. And Iskra Angelova, who is a TV journalist, prominent Bulgarian TV journalist, congratulates us on the interesting discussion, and she says that the decline of professional journalism also entails the very poor quality of media content and the lack of any arts and music content on all media outlets in Bulgaria, basically. Now I would like to ask the audience, do you have any questions so that we can continue with our discussion on the basis of them?
Добре, пак казвам, че ние малко просрочихме времето, за което се извинявам.
Okay, as I said, we have exhausted our time. I apologize for that. I would like to thank everyone involved, and I hope that we have been helpful.
Good job. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everyone for both the live audience and our live stream audience for attending this New Horizons in Journalism Conference. As I think I mentioned yesterday, this is the beginning of a 3-year effort. So hopefully we'll see you here sometime next year with a similar topic. But thank you, and thank you to the live stream audience. I think for the people here in the audience and the speakers, we may try to have a group photo. So if you don't mind standing up for a photo, that would be great. But I think we'll end the conference now, and again, thanks for attending.